Firstly, let me say, I'm a huge fan of the Dark Souls franchise. My whole channel is dedicated to it. So if you think I'm blindly bashing Dark Souls 3, rethink that. This is merely what I think went wrong. If you agree with me, fantastic. If you don't, let us know why. Let's have a proper sit down and discuss the various issues with the game. And as I said in the past, we are here because of one reason, and that's the love of these games. And in this video, there's going to be some spoilers, so if you're still going through the game, finish it up, come back later. So why is it when I'm playing through Dark Souls 3 I feel this love-hate relationship? Obviously when playing the third game in the series it's going to be compared to its predecessors, that being Dark Souls 1 and 2, and to some extent, Demon Souls. There's no getting around that. But we don't only compare Dark Souls 3 to that. We also compare it to Bloodborne. Is that our fault? Well, no. I think Dark Souls 3 has taken certain aspects from Bloodborne and they've shoved them into the game without no real explanation, but we'll get into that later. And when people complain that it's too easy, remember how shit you were when you first started riding a bike? It's like that. Demon Souls was hard, very hard. Dark Souls 1 still difficult but a tad easier. Dark Souls 2, it got easier. It's not that the games are getting easier, it's the fact that we're getting better at them. These games have spawned their own genre of games we call Souls-like. We're exposed to these games now, and the more we play, the better we'll get. And I think that's the reason From doesn't use its difficulty as a selling point. Even though it was ridiculous marketing, it worked, didn't it? How many people started playing because they heard it was hard? So what has Dark Souls 3 done right? Well, if you were to compare it to Dark Souls 2, which we must add was directed by two other gentlemen and not Hidetaka Miyazaki, the world of Dark Souls 3, even though it's in the Apocalypse era during the end of the life cycle in these games, the world as we know it is coming to an end, but it's still very easy on the eyes. It's a beautiful looking game. Buildings are filled with objects and environments are cluttered in a good way, with small details that make the world feel alive. Now look at Dark Souls 2. Now this may very well be the confusing development cycle it had, with them basically scrapping the game halfway through the development as it was rumoured to be shit, and almost starting again. Perhaps due to time constraints, the majority of the areas were just plain boxes we could run around in, if you really think about it. We've built up this crazy idea that we want to immerse ourselves into these horrible, messed up worlds, and there's nothing more that screams I am a game, taking away this illusion of immersion we have, than a plain box with awful texture work, and it's not very interesting to look at. But that wasn't the case throughout the entire game of Dark Souls 2. The Forest of Fallen Giants bonfire kind of hinted at what their true intention of the game was. They wanted this world to be full of, well, life, with vines falling off the tree, lighting from the bonfire illuminating the nearby details in the room. It was rather poetic, seeing these dead branches growing from these giants. They didn't let Dark Souls 2 flourish, give it time to grow. And let's not forget about Dragon's Eyrie. I still think it's one of the best looking zones in a Souls game. It was beautiful. But I think that's mainly down to what type of level Dragon's Eyrie was. It was a giant rock in the sky, masquerading this epic landscape in the distance. In the grand scheme of things, there still wasn't much going on, but because there was at least something going on, we deem it as one of the best areas. You had this sense you were a part of a world that was alive. These dragons could swoop down any minute. Of course they didn't, but that didn't matter. The illusion was there and we loved it. Luckily in Dark Souls 3, this laziness and level design, yes, I'm going to call it laziness, is completely gone. I can't think of one area where there's not something to look at, something going on. The world feels full, feels busy. Archdragon's Peak, I think, takes the crown from Dragon's Eyrie as the best looking area in a Souls game. I mean, just look at it. It's gorgeous. We're taken away from the dark, gloomy atmosphere we've become so familiar with, and greeted with a grand blue sky, dust traversing over the land. And we're teleported into the skies, into this bright zone, and you can feel this area doesn't really abide by the same rules as Lothric Kingdom. But again, we've seen this in Bloodborne, regarding environmental objects. The world in Bloodborne, yes, it was dark and gothic, but it was full. It felt like Yanam was an actual place, a place that was once inhabited by people, and not just a bland empty box that was stuck together at a later date. Now let's talk about the teleporting aspect of Dark Souls 3. If you've been following me, you'll know I straight up do not like teleporting around. Gameplay mechanics wise, yeah, sure, it makes sense. making the trip back to a certain area instantly, putting less pressure on the player to make progress because they can safely return back to the shrine. This non-connected, completely isolated area of the game where they can feel safe, gather their thoughts, collect the materials needed to proceed. Well, fuck that. This is a Souls game. To this day, I still feel the first half of Dark Souls 1 before the Lord's Vessel is the most innovative, gripping experience you can have in a video game. If you ventured into Blighttown without any poison moss, you were kind of fucked, unless you traversed all the way back up and purchased them from the undead merchant. Albeit not a long trip, but the option was there. And that's exactly my point, we had options. And this isn't the nostalgia talking, I promise you. Moving back onto the teleporting topic, I think it takes away from the level design, honestly. And I think my argument is backed up by, well, try to remember back when you played through Dark Souls 1. How many times did you unlock a shortcut and think, oh, I'm here now, awesome. It added weight to the world, made this land of Lordran feel, well, real, all interconnected. The areas had been thought out meticulously. Now Dark Souls 2, how many times did that happen? When did you unlock a shortcut and was filled with an absolute glee because you could make the journey back easier on yourself? Sure, there were methods you could bypass certain aspects of a level, but think, was there any way to get from one zone to another without naturally progressing on the laid out path? Okay. What about Bloodborne? Well, I do feel they expanded on them from Dark Souls 2, but you had that shit nailed in Dark Souls 1 all the way back in 2011. Why does it feel these games are taking steps backwards? Dark Souls 3, same as Bloodborne, you guys had this world design down to a T nearly 6 years ago. So what changed? I think my biggest beef with Dark Souls 3 is its intro level. On my initial blind playthrough, I went through the Graveyard of Ash and it was amazing. I stepped into the Firelink Shrine and instantly knew, okay, this is my safe area, where the NPCs would sell various things for my travels. Okay, fantastic. Now where do I go? Let's explore. I must have wandered around Firelink Shrine for nearly an hour before I figured out you had to sit at the bonfire and be thrust into the right direction. This pissed me off. And you could say, oh shut up Jake. How could something as small as that upset you? Well, to answer honestly, I don't know. And maybe this is the nostalgia speaking now, but when you were plopped down in Firelink Shrine in Dark Souls 1, that was that. There was nothing. The only way you knew if you were going the right way was through trial and error. The infamous graveyard screaming in people's faces, no, you're going the wrong way, you idiot. And in Dark Souls 3, we arrive on the high wall of Lothric and open up this beautiful vista and we can go one of two ways. One way will let us proceed with the level, and the other is a 2-minute journey to a dead end that rewards us with a bow and arrow. What's the point? Well, later in the level it is used for a shortcut, but that's besides the point. The only way I can justify it in my head is From was trying to tell the player you can go multiple ways and you'll be rewarded for doing so. And this is backed up by at the very start of the game there's a couple of routes you can take that all lead to dead ends, but they do reward you somewhat. Now I've got to get this out there, don't get me wrong, I love Dark Souls 3. But being a fan of the series and being so familiar with other games in the franchise, I do think it gives me this imaginary title that enables me to critique it. Another example of world design is, remember that feeling when you beat Osiris and find the untended graves behind the illusionary wall? Or if you were to do the Path of the Dragon emote in the Ethereal Dungeon, taking you to a completely hidden zone, just like in Bloodborne with Cainhurst. Just think of this from a developer's perspective. Hours and hours of blood, sweat and tears put into a zone that what, 10% of people will visit? That's something no other game does right. That takes some serious balls. Could you picture other AAA games hiding massive areas behind a secret? Maybe in true open world games, they'll hide areas around the land and let players discover them for themselves, but in Dark Souls 3 it's not an open world game, no matter what anyone says. You have a hub, the centre, which is Firelink, and you're set off to go explore various connected areas. It's not true open world. Once you get into Lothric, there's no other way to get back into Firelink without sitting through a loading screen. That being said, a couple of things it did right. The Covenants. Well, to some extent, I'm still to this day waiting to be summoned as a Blade of the Darkmoon. I loved the guilty system they had in Dark Souls 2. Being able to invade the world of the guilty, the auto-summon feature was one of the most disliked parts of the online component in Dark Souls 2. So why make it a feature of half of the Covenants in Dark Souls 3? It doesn't work now when there's thousands of players. What happens when the game is becoming less popular? Now I could get a lot of stick for saying this, or people telling me to get good, but I hate the PvP in Dark Souls 3. I just can't stand it. No, I could play Dark Souls 2 PvP for hours, so what makes it different? Mechanically, it's there, almost. Although I must say, when people complain about a poise bug and then From comes forward and says, oh no, that's actually part of the game, questions can arise about some of the design choices that have gone into this. This is supposed to be the last Dark Souls game. You needed to perfect the PvP. There's no other way to put it lightly. You needed to get this right. So gamers are playing this years down the line, and I'll tell you the biggest gripe I have. Invasions. It's not the poise or the dark sword spammers, even though they're bloody annoying, and I'm not even sure what the big PvPers like Peeve, Ouroboros or UCAS's opinion is on this. But to me, it's the 2v1, the 3v1 invasions. Now of course I think invaders should be at a disadvantage, that goes without saying. But it adds to what Dark Souls 2 difficulty suffered with, this artificial difficulty, driven by throwing a bunch of enemies at you at once. It's not difficult because they're more powerful than you, it's down to a numbers thing, and as much as I want to say it's not fair on invaders, it shouldn't be fair on invaders, but they're going at it the wrong way. The difficulty shouldn't be a numbers game. But 1v1 invasions do exist. I've had a couple, and if I've lost I've never made any excuses, or perhaps this is me as a player, maybe this is how I play. But if I've lost, I've always said to myself, oh well, they beat me fair and square. But if I've lost to a host and 2 other people, it's very easy for me to point the finger at that being the problem. Again, I'm not saying you can't win these crazy gank fests, you totally can. But everything has to go your way. Maybe the mobs helped you, maybe the summons just aren't that good. Maybe I was just unlucky, but nearly every invasion there'd be a squad of people. Now as I said, this is perfectly fine. I'm not saying you should play through the game on your own, but because I don't have the right to tell people how to play the game. If they want to buddy up, let them do so. But if you're a host and you summon someone to help you through an area, they get put on some kind of priority list for invasions, and can turn his world from a simple 2-player co-op experience to a multiplayer fuckfest. And I think that's the best words for it, honestly. What if the host is a completely new player with no intention of PvPing and just wants some help with the boss? Well, within seconds you can get the max amount of players in a world because someone decided to bring someone in. But if you're looking for 1v1 fights, then you can stick your red soapstone down and still get the Covenant rewards, but it's not the same. Call me a dickhead all you want, but one of the main reasons I personally invaded was to halt someone's progress, because I've been at the receiving end of this. You get invaded and you freeze up, especially if you've made a lot of progress, and if you die now it's going to be such a detriment to your progression. That's what Dark Souls is all about, the fear of progression, the fear of the unknown. And you're giving that power to the players, which is just amazing. With the multi-gank fest, you're taking that pivotal part of Dark Souls out and turning it from an elegant duel between 2 players, the invader wanting to halt progress and reap rewards, and the invadee wanting to best this invader to carry on with their progression. There's so much tension from these fights, most people don't even realise it's there. It harkens back to a feeling I felt playing the DayZ mod nearly 5 years ago. When you meet another player, your heart begins to race. When you're on the receiving end of an invasion, it's like this. But when you've got 2 cronies behind you, the feeling just isn't the same. It just doesn't capture that feeling of dread when you're the host. And I really do honestly feel it's now lost. Maybe when the game dies down, 1v1 invasions will become a thing again. But as of now, it's just not an area of the game where I want to delve into anymore. This reason alone is why I just can't PvP anymore. And I don't know if I'm alone in this, but as I said, this is supposed to be the last Dark Souls. It was of such high importance you got this right. So important. And well, they didn't. Another aspect of the game I'm glad they got rid of was the durability mechanic. Well, not got rid of, but they fixed it. During my playthrough of Dark Souls 2 I was on PC, and I did hear that there was a bug that because the game was in 60 FPS, it meant weapons degraded 2 times as quick, and it would put me off clearing the zone as I was travelling through because my weapon couldn't take it. I'd make it halfway through a zone and my weapon would break. This seems to have been addressed in Dark Souls 3. Durability is still a thing, but it isn't this giant burden lingering over you as you go through areas of the game. Which is odd. Dark Souls 3 is a fast-paced game, not as fast as Bloodborne, but compared to the other Souls games, especially Dark Souls 1 where it felt clunky, you could feel the weight of your armour. Combat in Dark Souls 3 has been refined further, adding in weapon arts, the return of the FP bar from Demon Souls, completely scrapping the spell usage mechanic, trying to make spell users relevant or viable again. It doesn't, but the option's still there. The UI changed again, keeping the same box-style navigation, but somehow it feels they've taken another step back. In Dark Souls 2, it added the ability to crush or consume a number of items all at once, and this was great. Also, another thing was when you brought up the menu, it would move your character to the right hand side so you'd be able to see your entire character and look at them whilst you changed armor and whatnot. But this changed. It defaults to whenever you consume something, it takes you out of the menu, making you go back into the menu and carry on with whatever you were doing. And yes, I know you can use the hide feature and it will stop this from happening, but why is this even a feature? Why is this a thing? Dark Souls 2 had an idea and it worked, so instead work on that, don't move backwards, overcomplicating something that really didn't need it. A user interface should be as simple as possible, even in a Souls game where you're picking up items with convoluted names. It should be easy to look at and easy to navigate. And you removed a feature from Dark Souls 2 which I used religiously and didn't even realise I did until I played through Dark Souls 3. And that was using the left and right bumper to navigate the initial menu. Why did that get removed? Like I mentioned earlier, you've had years to work on this. And you started to make progress, but you stopped. Okay, so moving away from mechanics, why does this game even exist? Is it to wrap up the story? Well, as the Ashen One, you were made to complete this never-ending cycle of the curse. I'm going to talk about the Ashen One in greater detail in a later video. But this game feels to me as a love letter to Dark Souls 1 players. But it's a love letter we didn't ask for. Did we want another Souls game? Who the hell wouldn't? And as cool as it is to see references to other titles, it needed some ground to do so. This is a Souls game, after all. From are very deliberate with their words and what they place in the world. For example, the chairs on High Wall of Lothric aren't just chairs. They're there for a purpose. Hollows would gather around the dragons and watch them while sat on these chairs. Everything has its purpose and place. So when you throw references into the mix, they have to be able to stand on their own 2 feet. And what From has done here is nothing short of a giant victory. Not only have they lined the game with references to Dark Souls 1, Seath, Gwyn, and let's not forget Anor Londo, but even the black sheep of the franchise, Dark Souls 2, they've made them make sense. Linking all these games together, and when you think of how convoluted the Souls story is, having to pick and choose who and what you put into these games must have taken some thought. A lot. And a lot of thought. So at the end of the day, Dark Souls 3 is a fucking great game, but it's not my favourite Souls game, not by a long shot. And I'm kind of glad they're ending it with this one, so they can move on to other ventures, and with the imminent DLC coming, I do hope it discusses some unanswered questions. Like who the Ashen One was before they came the Ashen One. Maybe we'll see Flan, find out what happened to Guinevere. I wouldn't hold your breath. And I'm going to be continuing my lore videos, as I'm so entranced by Dark Souls 3 lore at the moment, and I know you guys appreciate them. Until then, take care everyone, be good to one another, and have a great day.